right, go ahead and take out your Bibles this evening then. And let's see here, Genesis 21. Genesis 21. We don't have too many more how to live peaceably in a world that is full of joy and pain and all of the difficulties that we can even ourselves bring into some of these different relationships. So Genesis 21, let me read a few verses here, kind of set some context, and then I believe we have some really key points here. What does it take? What does it look like to experience the joy in the Christian life that God says is possible? We're going to consider the birth of Isaac and some things that this particular passage highlights about God's working in that story of joy. And then we're going to see, I believe, as the story focuses our attention, not on every single difficulty, but on one particular kind of difficulty, the decisions that we make in our flesh. When we choose to do things under our own power and the pain that brings in our lives. And then I want to talk about the peace here that we see here in the story of Abimelech and Abraham as they learn to live together with one another. Genesis 21, I'm going to just jump right in here to the text. The Lord visited, verse number 1, Sarah, as he had said. And the Lord did unto Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac, being 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born unto him. He would have been drawing Social Security for 35 years? by the time he has Isaac here. This was probably not a really easy situation for Isaac as an old man, as Sarah as an older woman here, now having to raise a newborn baby, right? But notice Sarah's response here in verse number 6. And Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all that hear will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. You can hear the joy, the pride here as Sarah gets to experience receiving this promise that God had made to her. Verse number 8, the child grew and was weaned. And so at this point here in this culture, that Isaac would be about 3 or 4 years old here at this point. Abraham made a great feast the same day that Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, which she had borne unto Abraham, mocking. At this point, before we just read right on through these verses, Isaac here, 3 to 4 years old, Ishmael would have been 16 or 17 years old. Now, maybe, there may be some families here where you have some really broad age gaps between children and families. There are some pretty unique difficulties that can be brought in on a family here when an only child or the eldest child, when there's these significant 10, 11-year age gaps, right, between children there. There's not going to be the kind of relationship between children here that a family, well, like our kids, all within a couple of years of one another, they get along. Well, no, they fight and bicker like anybody else's kids do. But there's a relationship there that Isaac and Ishmael wouldn't have had. Add to that Ishmael was not this child of heir, this promised child here. Before Isaac, Ishmael would have received all of the blessings, all of the inheritance there from Abraham, and now this little twerp shows up. Well, that's what Ishmael would have been thinking. Before we're too hard here on Ishmael, there was an awful lot about this situation that was pretty hard. Now, it's significant, and we'll emphasize this here in a moment. Why was this situation the way that it was? Because of Abraham and Sarah's lack of faith. because they tried to do things in their own power to satisfy God's promise on their own. And we're going to see that that particular aspect of this whole situation is precisely why God works in this situation there, why Hagar and Ishmael have to leave. Continue reading here with me. Let's see here. Where do we leave off? Verse number 9. Verse number 10. Wherefore Sarah, she said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was very grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. And God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman. In all that Sarah hath said unto thee, hearken unto her, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And also of the son of the bondwoman, God is still talking here, I will make him a nation, because he is thy seed. And Abraham rose up early in the morning and took bread and a bottle of water and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder and to the child, and sent her away, and she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. The water was spent in the bottle. She cast the child under one of the shrubs, and she went and sat her down over against him a good way off, as it were a bow shot. For she said, let me not see the death of the child. And she sat over against him and lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard this is interesting here, isn't it? And God heard the voice of the lad. And the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said unto her, what aileth thee, Hagar? Fear not, for God hath heard the voice of the lad where he is. Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation. God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the bottle with water and gave the lad drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer, and he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. And we'll come back to the third part of this story here in just a moment, but let me try to set up some contrast here, some comparison, as we consider first off, in the first section here, the possibility of joy in this life of faith. Can you imagine, we haven't really highlighted this up to this point. Does anybody remember what Abram's name meant before his name was changed to Abraham? It meant the father of many. Abram, right? How many children did Abram have? At that point, he had none. Can you imagine somebody walking, and this was back in those days when people put a lot of stock in the names and how those names came to be, and the value, the meaning of those names, right? And so every time somebody, maybe not every time, but I'm sure that conversation was had. I'm Abram, I'm the father of many, but I don't have any. And then God changes his name to Abraham, right? Which means the father of many multitudes. So just take that whole feeling and multiply that. This is all before Ishmael even is born. How many kids do you have, Abraham? The father of many multitudes, right? Well, I don't have any. Well, why not? I thought you said God had promised you a kid, right? Okay, I am sure that as we understand perhaps what is going on in Abraham's and Sarah's mind here, when this day finally comes, Genesis 21, and Isaac is born, can you imagine the joy that these two individuals felt? I believe that we see, let me try to, what is the ground? Why can we experience joy in our Christian life? Does our joy come because all of these situations in life work out the way that we want them to? Well, no, they don't. Because how often does life actually work out the way that we want it to, right? Why are Abraham and Sarah able to experience joy here? Well, it comes right down to one thing. God kept his word. God had promised, in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Sarah shall have a son. And God kept that promise. And because God kept his promise, there was no other reason here. In this story, we see an incredible amount of joy because what God had said, God had done. Now, the application to that just about preaches itself. How many times has God made us a promise? If God has promised it, it'll be done. Now, the next part of this, the Abraham and Sarah, that this joy was grounded in the confidence that they could have in the trustworthiness of God. But we highlighted it here a minute ago. How long did it take that promise to get fulfilled? 100 years. And we start moaning and groaning if God doesn't answer our prayer in a couple of days. Or if we've got to pray 15, 20, 25 years for someone's salvation. God answers prayer. God keeps his promises, but he does it in his time. See, look with me here at verse number 2. See the emphasis here. Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age. Look at this next phrase. At the set time. Who set that time? God did. It's very similar language. What is it? Galatians 4, where it talks about God sending his son when the fullness of the time was come. God sent forth his son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law. At the right time, God kept his word. His plan, his purpose was accomplished as God determined was the right time to do that. Now that's where it gets hard, isn't it? Because, I would really like those bills paid right now. Oh, I really want this friend, this family member to come to Christ right now. Oh, I want these folks in our prayer list that are in the hospital that are struggling. I want them healed right now. But God's perspective is very different than ours, isn't it? And while we may want this right now, it may not be the right time for that prayer to be answered. We can trust that God will keep his promises. He's going to do it in his time. And I think it is significant here. If you look at verse number 2, it emphasizes here, it's almost, how many times do you see here it emphasizes that Abraham and Sarah were old when Isaac was born? How many times do you have to say it, right? We know 100 years old, 90 years old, right? Look at verse number 2. Sarah conceived, bare Abraham a son in his old age. Verse number 5, Abraham was 100 years old. Verse number 7, and who would have thought that I would bear Abraham a son in his old... Okay, why is God emphasizing here that Abraham was an old man? I think it is significant here that God waited until there was no possible way for Abraham to have a son on his own. Abraham had come to the end of himself. I'm sure I've used this quote before. You might write down the name George Mueller if you don't know who that is. A fellow by the name of George Mueller over in Bristol, England, ran a bunch of orphanages. Just tremendous testimony of answers to prayer. He said this: there is no glory for God in that which is humanly possible. God's glory begins where man's power ends. And this story here, there's no way, no one would have thought that Abraham, a 100-year-old man, would be able to have a son. That's why it is so incredible. Who gets the glory for this? Only God. Now, when we look at this story here, and we see just how carefully I think this passage draws us to see that Abraham could not do this. But how often do we try to give God glory based on let me try to illustrate it this way. You're familiar with the stories of the judges, right? You know, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, the 400 some odd years there. After Joshua had gone in, they led the people into the land of Canaan. They had conquered much of the land of Canaan, and then the judges take over. Remember what is very typical there of the time period of the judges? Israel would do fine for a while, right? They would obey God, and then they would begin to fall into idolatry. They would worship false gods, and so God would bring in an enemy that would destroy them, that would defeat them in battle, that would put them under bondage there, and there would be sometimes a significant time where they were ruled by those that hated God and just worked to the destruction of the people of Israel, and they would cry out to God, and God would send a deliverer who would lead them in victory against their oppressors, and then while that judge was alive, right, everything would go well. That judge would die, and the cycle would start all over again. For hundreds of years, the cycle of victory and defeat, victory and defeat. I used to think of, there's some really familiar judges. Othniel is one of that's fairly well known. He was a grandson of Caleb, remember? The first judge, you might remember Samson, right? Perhaps the most familiar of the judges. I used to look at the judges as the heroes, the victors, the good guys in the story. But how does every single story of the judges end? Every single one of them ends with failure. And it's really interesting as you begin to read through the stories of the judges, how the Bible highlights different things about each judge. Like Othniel was the grandson of Caleb, this dynamic leader. The first judge willing to step up and lead when nobody else was willing to, and he failed to bring lasting victory to the people of Israel.